This week's blog post is the fifth in my series on the history of outdoor sculpture, and it covers businessmen. This occasional series of blog posts will highlight the most important of the outdoor sculptures in New York City and provide some historical and art historical context. To read other blog posts in this series, click on the New York City Sculpture tag on DianeDurantewriter.com. For photos of all outdoor sculptures in New York City in chronological order, see my Instagram page, which is this link down here. Before we look at changes in style and important sculptors, we're doing a quick survey of the subjects of outdoor sculptures. In the first post in this series, we saw sculptures of animals and politicians. In the second, we saw our first military and literary heroes. The third post included a list of memorials to the Civil War, and the fourth post, figures active before 1800, including founding fathers. In the late 1860s, a new subject appears: businessmen who expanded the range of human accomplishments. Not coincidentally, they start to appear around the time the Gilded Age begins. The last major memorial to a businessman was erected just as the nation collapsed into the Great Depression. This, the first sculpture commemorating a businessman, is Cornelius Vanderbilt, 1794 to 1877. Vanderbilt, an uneducated farm boy, provided his fellow Americans with transportation by sailboat, steamboat, and railroads. He was worth $100 million or so when he died, probably the richest American of his time. This sculpture now stands on the south facade of Grand Central Terminal at the level of the Park Avenue Viaduct, but it was originally commissioned as the centerpiece of a 150-foot-long, 31-foot-high pediment on Vanderbilt's Hudson River Railroad freight depot, just south of Canal Street. So New York City's first sculpture honoring a businessman was commissioned by the businessman himself. But several other important businessmen were honored within a decade. This one is Samuel Finley Breese Morse. Morse's telegraph changed the pace of communication worldwide, and in so doing made New York City the nation's financial hub. After all, why deal with the stock market in Philadelphia or Boston when you could contact Wall Street almost instantly? Funds for this statue were raised by telegraph operators across the country when Morse was 79 years old. This was the last sculpture placed in Central Park, while its subject was still alive to attend the dedication. In order to keep the park from filling up with sculptures of people who might turn out to be insignificant, the park commissioners ruled in 1873 that at least 5 years had to elapse after a person's death before a sculpture could be erected to honor them in the park. Robert Fulton, 1765 to 1815, was the inventor of the Clermont, the first functioning steamboat. Its introduction in 1807 led to a revolution in river and ocean travel. This sculpture, commissioned by the Society of Old Brooklynites, originally stood near the Fulton Ferry House at the foot of Fulton Street in Brooklyn. Currently standing at Schenectady Avenue and Fulton Street in Brooklyn is a bronze copy of the original, very deteriorated, zinc sculpture. Speaking of men who turned out to be relatively insignificant, at the dedication of this sculpture of William Earl Dodge, 1805 to 83, the mayor of New York said, quote, "There are men who can wait for recognition, and there are, on the other hand, characters which demand present recognition if recognition is ever to be given." End of quote. John Quincy Adams Ward, on whose works I will do a blog post presently, sculpted this elegant figure of Dodge, who was the co-founder of Phelps Dodge. Phelps Dodge was a major mining company for almost a century. Dodge was more widely known as the Christian merchant. The pile of books on which he elegantly leans reminds us that he was a gentleman of learning and culture, as well as a businessman. A few years after he sculpted Dodge, John Quincy Adams Ward created this bust of Alexander Lyman Holly. When railroads were spreading across America, the average life of rails, made of iron, was 2 years. Holly almost single-handedly introduced mass steel production to the United States, designing 11 of the 12 Bessemer steel plants that were built here. The average life of steel rails was close to 15 years. Horace Greeley, 1811 to 72, was the founder and editor of the enormously influential New York Tribune, the first New York newspaper to attempt to provide all the information an educated man might need to run his life and his business. Greeley is honored in 2 full-size bronze figures in Manhattan and a bronze bust at his grave in the Greenwood Cemetery. The best of the 3 sculptures is not surprisingly by John Quincy Adams Ward. It was commissioned for a niche on the Tribune's headquarters near the Brooklyn Bridge. Research and surgical procedures by the father of gynecology saved uncounted thousands, probably millions, of women who were suffering and dying from female complaints. This bronze of Dr. J. Marion Sims, 1813-83, by Ferdinand von Miller II, once stood on Fifth Avenue at 103rd Street across from the Academy of Medicine. It will eventually reappear in the Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn. Peter Cooper's successes and innovations ranged from the I-beam and the tom-thumb locomotive to powdered gelatin, which we know as Jell-O. As a child, Cooper only attended school for 52 days. Feeling that he would have wasted less time as an innovator had he been better educated, Cooper, when he was in his 60s, established and endowed the Cooper Union for the Advancement of Science and Art at Astor Place. Augustus St. Gaudens, an early student at the Cooper Union, became one of America's most renowned sculptors. He created this work honoring the founder of the Cooper Union. There will be a blog post upcoming on St. Gaudens. During the Civil War, John Eriksson, 1803 to 1889, a Swedish-born engineer, designed the Monitor, the Union's first ironclad. Eriksson here holds a model of the Monitor. Jonathan Scott Hartley, the sculptor of this portrait, was so dissatisfied with his original Eriksson, dedicated in 1893, that he paid to have this version cast. The Monitor is also honored with a sculpture in McGolrick Park, Brooklyn, near where the ironclad was constructed. And finally, Samuel Rea, 1855 to 1929, was president of the Pennsylvania Railroad for over a decade, including the years when the PRR tunnel was built under the Hudson River and the original Grand Pennsylvania station was completed. Rea has a model of part of the station under his hand. The sculpture was originally set in a niche high on the wall of Penn Station. It's the work of Adolph A. Weinman, who created many of the other sculptures for the original Penn Station. If you've been looking at the previous posts in this series, you may remember that at the end of the posts on sculptures that honor military, historical figures, heroes of immigrants, and so on, I listed additional examples. Well, I'm not doing that here because the ones that I've just shown you are the only tributes to specific businessmen that stand in New York City. It is not a coincidence that such sculptures became scarce in the early decades of the 20th century. That period saw the rise of the progressive movement, which considered industrialization, urbanization, and immigration as burgeoning problems that could only be eliminated or alleviated by massive legislative reforms. Would you care to guess what category of subjects becomes common in the early 20th century? But before we move on to those, next week we will look at sculptures honoring figures in the arts. DianeDuranteWriter.com has hundreds of posts on sculpture, painting, architecture, and my other obsessions. To join the free Sunday recommendations email list, visit the URL that's on the screen or email me. And you can say, "Well done, Diane," or support my work and receive rewards by means of the tip jar on DianeDuranteWriter.com. As always, thank you for listening.